I understand this is mainly people who are health professionals, so you'll have a chance to use it as well, hopefully, or maybe you already do. I wouldn't be surprised many of you already do some. Again, what we'll do is we'll talk about all three pillars, and we'll spend some time on that. And if you have questions about the first two pillars, it's probably best to talk about those at that time. And then we'll talk about 5 core recommendations around this third pillar, around this how you eat pillar. And then I have a couple stories that I'm going to share just of patients, just to make it interesting and to maybe help as far as inspiring us around these pillars. So the first thing I'm going to share is actually my visual that I love to show on lifestyle medicine as a whole. And these will be concepts that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, but just what I talk about in this is that when I went to medical school and when I did my residency training, most of my education was in the top 2 parts of this triangle. Procedures and medications. That's what I was trained to work with as a physician. And if you look at the healthcare system that's here in the US, I'm sure it's very similar there in Germany. The healthcare system is really based around those 2 levels as well. So we're doing procedures, we're providing various medications and chemicals and these sort of high risk, high cost, foreign invasive things to help our patients get better. And all of that's well and good, but if you look at the main causes of disease, the main things that bring patients into our offices and into our hospitals, 80 to 85% of them are chronic diseases. So diseases that last for more than a couple of weeks, which is things like diabetes, but also things like arthritis or even depression. All of these things are chronic diseases. And if you look at chronic diseases, 80 to 85% of them are directly related to a lifestyle choice. So the data is quite strong, and I'm sure you all agree with this, that if we fully adopted the best in lifestyle, if these 4 pillars that you see there, nourishment, movement, resilience, and connectedness, if we fully were balanced and fully adopted all of those, literally 80 to 85% of chronic disease would never occur in the population that's fully adopting that. The issue, of course, is that nobody fully adopts it. It's very hard to fully adopt. In our current culture anyways, it's hard to fully adopt. So these chronic diseases exist, and but the whole lifestyle medicine movement is, as you all know, I'm sure, is dedicated towards finding ways of moving down in this triangle, finding ways of starting our patient interactions in the bottom part of the triangle, keeping things low risk and low cost, and it actually works incredibly well. And again, I'll share a few stories, but of course, that's what this is about. We're talking about the first pillar this time around in this talk, the nourishment pillar. But just to go over the pillars briefly with you, And, you know, different people talk about these differently. Some people say 6 pillars, some people say 8 pillars. There's a variety of different approaches, but we like to keep it simple. And so for us, the 4 pillars are nourishment, which is anything coming into your body, food, water, drink, anything coming into your body, including toxic chemicals and those kinds of things. And then the second is movement. So that's how we spend our day. It's the different components of exercise. It's trying to not sit too much. It's you know, trying to live our lives or do our movement in an environment that's good. You know, so there's good exposure to sunshine and fresh air and all those kinds of things. The third pillar for us is what we call resilience. And resilience is both sleep and stress, because in our books, people who aren't sleeping well, the majority of time it's because they're being challenged as far as how they manage their stress. And if you can get people to manage their stress well, usually they'll start sleeping better. Now, there's a few other things around sleep that you have to pay attention to, but in my experience, in my personal experience actually, as well as in my experience in taking care of patients, sleep is directly related to how well I manage my stress. So that's the third pillar. And the fourth pillar we call connectedness, and we like to talk about vertical and horizontal connectedness. So horizontal connectedness is obviously your families and friends and your social networks. Vertical connectedness is your spirituality, your sense of purpose and meaning, and whatever beliefs and approaches that you take. And obviously in this group, I believe we're all Seventh-day Adventists. I think that's a fair statement. So this comes naturally to us. And I think it's nice that it's this component that comes naturally to us is a core component of lifestyle medicine. It works really well. And obviously, a lot of the lifestyle medicine movement has very strong Seventh-day Adventist ties around the world, actually. So just looking at that first pillar a little bit more, we already mentioned nourishment is not just your food, it's anything that comes into your system. Some people make a separate pillar of lifestyle medicine as far as staying away from tobacco and other harmful substances. We sort of obviously address that with every one of our patients, but if you want to find it in a pillar in our books, you would find it in this pillar, since we keep things simple at 4 pillars. Now, when you think about this nourishment pillar, there's a variety of ways you can analyze it or describe it or define it. But if you look at one of the things that I'm privileged to do is to chair the International Board of Lifestyle Medicine. So I get to interact with people literally around the world, and we get to talk about this nourishment pillar in a variety of different settings, a variety of different cultures in Asia and the Pacific and in the Middle East and South America. Here we're doing it in Europe. So we get to see that there's a lot of different cultures, a lot of different variations that will happen in each of those cultures. But this concept that Michael Pollan talked about in this book, Defense of Food, if you read around this head of lettuce, it says, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And that seems to be the core nutrition guideline that stands up to science and also stands up to a variety of different cultures, a variety of different approaches. So it's not very specific, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. But there's a lot of wisdom there. It's very concise and precise as far as heading us the right direction. So these are the 3 pillars. When we talk about the 3 pillars of lifestyle medicine, eat food is the first, not too much is the second, mostly plants is the third. A lot of us, when we think about lifestyle medicine, we actually start with the third pillar, the mostly plants pillar. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that in this talk, but I guess I do have that one slide where I say, you can debate what's the right percentage of calories that come from plants. But in my books, 95% is a good place to start. And that there's a variety of reasons why I come to the 95%, mostly plants statistic. I feel like it's as close as you can get scientifically. The reference on the bottom of this is looking at what's the right percentage of calories from plants for sustainability, for keeping our planet going. And this landmark article on the Lancet Commission that was published, I guess at this point, 3 years ago, came up with more or less 95% of calories should come from plants if our planet is going to be sustainable. But you can also look at history, and you can look at how our ancestors ate. You can look at how indigenous tribes, in the jungles of South America or other places where people are living very primitively, and they're also in the neighborhood of 95%. And I have references on that as well. So there's a lot of different angles that make me think that 95% is a good place to be. Now, obviously, I'm supportive of 100%. So some of you, it sounds like, are 100%, and I think that's great and probably only helps. But I don't think you have to be 100%, depending on the circumstances that you're in. Certain disease conditions, maybe 100% is good for those disease conditions. The other comment that I was going to make is that when you look at the animal-based calories, I actually think that the dairy is as challenging from a health perspective as any of the others. And some of that's based on data, but some of it's also just based on sense making. How many species drink the milk of other species? The milk that's meant for the infants of those other species. How many species keep drinking that throughout their lifetime? And maybe you know of some, but I only know of humans who do that. And so it just doesn't make sense that we would be drinking the milk from a different species that was meant for that species infant. And here we are as adults drinking it. Another reason why I'm concerned about dairy is that dairy is as a general rule, highly processed. And we're going to talk about that next slide, but we're trying to stay away from highly processed food, and dairy tends to be highly processed. So I have a lot of concerns about dairy, and I think you can debate a little bit more about organic farm bred meat. You can certainly have debates about fish. You can have debates about eggs. You can have debates about all of these things. But anyways, that's sort of my summary on mostly plants.
Can I just ask a question on?
Yeah, this is a good place to stop for questions.
Yeah, I'm just wondering. You mentioned that 5%, the 5%. I mean, 100% is good, but could the 5% be good in itself to include, for example, eggs? I know several vegans who eat free-range, healthy, organic eggs. Do you think there's something that one could be missing of minerals and as a vegan that we need more of, like iodine perhaps, or yeah? Right.
Well, so we presumably we all know that obviously you do not get vitamin B12 if you're 100% vegan. So that's a supplement that we'll need to get or find a way of getting that into our systems. My understanding of the science is that there's not a whole lot of anything else documented to consistently be a problem in a particular vegan population. Iodine, that's a sort of a hot topic right now. And, if you look at historically iodine and iodine deficiency, it was really more related to soil quality. And if you happen to live in an area that had a fair bit of iodine in your soil, then that iodine would also come through into your plants, and then you wouldn't have any trouble with iodine deficiency. But if you lived in an area where there was not a lot of iodine in the soil, then you would be more prone to iodine deficiency. And obviously we've corrected that by putting iodine and salt and a variety of other things to decrease the deficiencies. But it's something that a lot of people are talking about right now, iodine. But having been around these things for a while now, that's the way it goes, right? So it's vitamin D, or it's probiotics, or it's there's these topics that come and go, and generally they come and go based on, in my experience, based not on really good epidemiologic science. It's more based on a study here or a study there, and so anyways, bottom line is, outside of vitamin B12, I'm not aware of any studies that show that you need to eat meat, or need to eat any animal products. I do believe that a wide variety is good. So, does that mean a wide variety of animal products is good, even if you're, less than 5%? I don't know. I do think of the 4 things that are on this list: meat, fish, dairy, and eggs. I think that eggs are probably the component that makes the most sense to me. Again, if you just look at species around the world, that different species, eggs are commonly eaten. From one species will eat another species' eggs. That's not a uniquely human thing. Sort of like dairy is. Also, obviously, eating fish and meat, that's not a uniquely human thing too. The thing that's, in my books, uniquely human is the dairy piece. And obviously in the meat, there's the red meat, there's the white meat, and there's the fish. And we, in our practice, we have a 2-2-2 rule. Our 2-2-2 rule says fish, scientifically, you can justify that a couple times a week. White meat, so chicken and turkey, you can scientifically justify that twice a month. And red meat, so your beef and your pork and your various red meats, you can scientifically justify that twice a year. So that's the 2-2-2 rule: twice a week for fish, twice a month for the white meats, and twice a year for the red meats. So again, there's some science behind that, but people just sort of like a little bit of a guideline, a little bit of structure. So this is what we threw out, not to say that it's the final answer. It just gives you a ballpark to be sitting in. Other questions about this? Okay, so let's go on to what's the first pillar. So Michael Pollan first said eat food. And when he says food, what he means is whole food. So what he means is staying away from the processed things that are put in the grocery store as food, but it's really a mixture of chemicals, and it really shouldn't even be classified as food. And so, when you're talking about plant-based, that usually is easy for people to grasp. They understand what an animal is and what a plant is and what a plant-based food is. When you talk about whole food, that's a lot harder to grasp for the average patient, for the average person. So how do you define whole food? Well, there's a couple definitions here. Food is grown, or food that, as you visualize it, it hasn't really changed from when it was being grown and when it's going into your mouth. So you know everything that's happened to it. But then another way of looking at it is this NOVA food classification. So this was Dr. Montero is actually out of Brazil. So this NOVA food classification actually came out of the country of Brazil. And it classifies food into 4 categories. And just to summarize these categories, the first category is unprocessed or minimally processed foods. So unprocessed means obviously as grown. Minimally processed means that you've done very simple things to it, like you may have frozen it first before you ate it. You may have steamed it first before you ate it. You may have cut it, you know, into slices, or maybe smashed it a little bit, or somehow changed it slightly, but it's not very different from how it was grown. So that's the first category. The second category, it uses the term processed culinary ingredients. And processed culinary ingredients basically means the kinds of things that you would find in your kitchen. So it's things like sugar and salt and oil. Those are the core processed culinary ingredients. So you may have heard of the term SOFAs free. SOFAs free means it's an acronym. So S stands for sugar, O stands for oil, F stands for flour, A stands for alcohol, and then the final S stands for salt. So that's an acronym, SOFAs free. So that's a one way of trying to understand what whole food is and how you stay away from it. Another simpler one is SOS. SOS is just the 3, the sugar, the oil, and the salt. So SOS free. If you're SOS free, if you're not eating any sugar, oil, or salt, you're not having anything as processed culinary ingredients. So it's a little bit up for debate as to how much of those processed culinary ingredients you can have. I think it's probably okay to have small amounts of all 3 of them, sugar, oil, and salt, in your home baking, your home food preparation. The issue is when we go out to eat, or when we start eating some of these more processed foods, you start getting larger amounts of those and higher percentages of those. So that's where it's really a problem. The processed food, that's when you've significantly changed how the food is. So when you go from a wheat grain to a loaf of bread, or you go from a wheat grain to pasta, that's going into processed food. When you go from an apple to applesauce, because you've actually done some straining, you've taken out the peelings and some other things, that's processed food. So when you go, it depends, but generally when you go from, say, garbanzo beans to hummus, or from peanuts to peanut butter, then you're going to processed food. You're changing how it looks and how it reacts in your body, how you actually assimilate it into your body, because with these processed foods, we're not chewing them as much as we do with the unprocessed foods, generally, as a general rule. Another example would be tofu compared to soybeans. And again, this is a challenging area because there's all kinds of variations. You know, if you look at bread as an example, there's some bread that's really quite healthy for you. No bread is unprocessed because there's not bread trees out there. But there's some bread that's still relatively healthy for you. But there's obviously also some bread that's incredibly unhealthy, that's closer to that ultra processed food. But anyway, so that's the third category. The fourth category, that's obviously the bad stuff. That's the stuff that has the chemicals, the flavorings, the colorings, the preservatives, any number of other things in it. And it's not created out in a field or in an orchard. It's created in a manufacturing plant, not a natural plant. And that's the stuff that's really driving our chronic disease epidemic, is that ultra processed food. So again, I sort of just made up something here. 80% of calories should come from group 1. Probably it's okay to have a bit of group 2 in that 80% of calories, as long as you're just doing your home cooking and using very small amounts of oil and salt and sugar. But you want to watch the amount of processed food you eat. So I think it's important to be careful. You don't want to overdo bread. You don't want to overdo pasta. You don't want to overdo tortillas or other things along those lines. You don't want to overdo white rice as another example. If you look at your potatoes, you want your potatoes to be more your baked potatoes or your boiled potatoes, not your French fries or your mashed potatoes that tend to have a lot of other things mixed in them. So you really want to be mainly in the category 1 and maybe category 2. And then the thing that's bad is the ultra processed food and drink. Okay, so we spent a lot of time on these slides, which I sort of knew we were going to, but any questions on this slide? So I just put in a brief story. This person, this is not his actual picture, and Manny's not his actual name, but he's a real patient of ours that was actually this is a gentleman, he's an actual patient of mine, and he had developed diabetes. He went plant-based, and he lost a lot of weight, and his diabetes went into remission. He did that on his own. He did that without a doctor's help. He just did research and read a lot and got to that good place. But then his diabetes started coming back to him, and he found me as a doctor. And I said, well, there's 3 pillars. It's not just the plant-based pillar, it's the whole food pillar. And so we added that in, and he lost additional weight, and again, his diabetes reversed. And usually that's the way it works. I usually, it's easier to start with the whole food. Easier to start with the plant-based pillar, and then the whole food pillar. And then usually this 3rd pillar that we're getting ready to talk about is the one that comes last, at least for me as I'm working with my patients. Okay, so for the 3rd pillar, the not too much, there's 5 general guidelines. We're going to talk about each one of these, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. We're going to get to each one of these, but they're basically eating less frequently, observing time-restricted eating, doing partial fast days, doing periodic prolonged fasting, and then mindfulness as you eat. I do like to give credit to Dr. Walter Longo. Dr. Longo is actually an Italian, but he spent most of his professional career actually here in Southern California, the University of Southern California. But he wrote this book, The Longevity Diet. Just out of curiosity, has anybody read this book? So that means it's going to be something you're not that familiar with, which is hopefully good. So this book talks a lot about what you eat, but it focuses primarily on how you eat. And he gives a variety of guidelines, and you can see under how you eat, he gives 3 of the 5 guidelines that we talked about come directly from him. And Dr. Longo is actually an aging researcher, and the data is quite clear that people who eat less live longer. This is incredibly clear in other species. It's slightly less clear in the human species, but there is reason to believe that eating less extends lifespan, not just in other species, but also in animals. I mean, also in humans, I should say. We know it extends lifespan in monkeys, eating less. We know it does in a variety of other animal species. So, so we've done the 3 pillars of healthy eating. Now we're going to talk about the 5 core general guidelines. So the first guideline is to eat 2 meals per day. And Walter Longo says this should always include breakfast. And I'm a huge fan of beans for breakfast. And I'm trying to think, I spent some time in Germany, and I believe that beans for breakfast actually is natural in the German cuisine. Is that correct, or is that not correct? It's not correct. So people in Germany don't really eat beans for breakfast. So they don't in the US either. Obviously, it's a very foreign thing to a lot of my patients. But if you look at a lot of cultures around the world, beans for breakfast is very common, very typical. It's true in the British culture, historically anyways, in the British culture. It's true in the Indian culture. It's true in the South American culture. It's true in the Middle Eastern culture. It's true in a lot of Asian cultures. So eating beans for breakfast, and it makes sense scientifically because it's nice to start the day with a protein load, and beans are one of your best sources of protein. So eating 2 meals a day, you start off with a good breakfast, and then you have a second meal. And your second meal can be lunch, or it can be dinner, or if your schedule is such, you can make it sort of in the middle of the afternoon and call it Lupper or whatever you want to call it. But that's the recommendation for Dr. Longo. Dr. Longo does say you can have a snack during the skipped meal time. So if you eat a breakfast and a lunch, then you can have a small snack in the evening. Or if you eat a breakfast and a dinner, again, you can have a small midday snack. But the point being here, we need to eat less frequently. We've gotten into habits, and I don't think of Germany as being quite as bad as the US as far as lifestyle. I think on average, the Germans are slightly better than the US, but I think it's probably slightly better. There's still a lot of challenges. One of those challenges is just eating all the time. Having food in front of you, eating, snacking, grazing as we go through the day. So this is a study that was done and published a few years ago, but it was looking at frequency of eating. This was primarily in the US. And it was looking at frequency of eating. You can see on the left-hand side here, this is for children. The right-hand side, it's for adults. And it's looking at it in 1977, 78. And then another 15 to 20 years later. And then again, another 10 or 12 years after that. So what they found is that historically, the average number of times that we ate was very close to 3. So both adults and children, it was close to 3. If anything, the most frequent amount of times people ate was slightly less than 3. But then it sort of, there was still some who ate more frequently, even back in the 1970s. If you look at the triangles, obviously, the most frequent was getting closer to 4 times a day. And then if you go to the early 2000s, looking at these sort of diamond, the lighter color, then all of a sudden the frequency is 4 to 5 times a day for the younger kids. And even for the adults, it's, again, 4 to 5 times a day. So we're eating more frequently. And Walter Longo says that's not the right thing to do. So when you're talking about how you eat with patients, one of the things to put on the table is to eat less frequently. Before we talk about the next two recommendations, I want to just make this clarification. So the word intermittent fasting is used a lot right now. It's one of these things that's on Google, it's on the internet, and it's talked to a lot of. And one of the people that's been stimulating this discussion is a Canadian physician by the name of Jason Fung. And he has primarily talked about intermittent fasting in the context of this term time-restricted eating, which we'll go to the definition of that, but basically it's not eating for a certain number of hours each day. But intermittent fasting is also this concept of periodic fasting, where you eat less calories once or twice a week. And the most specific discussion of that is this concept of the 5-2 diet, where you eat a regular number of calories 5 days a week, and then 2 days a week you eat a restricted caloric diet. So both of these are called intermittent fasting. But in this talk, what we're using is the term time-restricted eating or time-restricted feeding for the not eating for a certain number of hours each day, and we're using the term periodic fasting for this 24-hour rhythmic decreased calorie restriction. So time-restricted eating or time-restricted feeding is where you eat all of your food within a specified time period. Generally, the largest amount of time you'll allow yourself to eat is 12 hours. So time-restricted feeding is generally allowing yourself to eat at a 12-hour interval or less. So it might be 10 hours, it might be 8 hours. Some people will go even less than that. So all your food goes into your mouth during those 8 hours or during those 10 hours or during those 12 hours. Scientifically, and I actually had a chance to meet Dr. Longo and ask him this question specifically. Scientifically, and this is his take, obviously he's one scientist, but his take is that the ideal time seems to be 8, 10, or 12-hour periods. So there are people that will eat all of their food within a 4-hour period or within a 6-hour period of time. But there's a challenge of sustainability with that. That's something that's hard to do long term. But there's also some debatable issues around certain health concerns. So for instance, your gallbladder, it seems like there's more gallstones if you're doing time-restricted eating in a very short window, in a 4-hour, 6-hour window. Time-restricted feeding does positively change things like your body's insulin levels, your cell's responsiveness to insulin. It improves insulin resistance. So there's, again, good data that time-restricted feeding or time-restricted eating has positive changes. And you can also do it in a way that you aren't starving all the time. So if your body gets used to this, your body actually generally feels less hungry than someone who's grazing and snacking all the time. So the third component of how you eat, or third component of this third pillar, is this idea of a partial fast day. And what a partial fast day is, you'll choose, it's usually 1 day per week or 2 days per week. 5-2 is 2 days per week. And on those days, you will eat less calories. And usually the calorie restriction is going to be closer to the 600 or 800 calorie restriction place. And this usually is best done rhythmically. So you can say it's going to be every Thursday or every Saturday or whatever day you choose. That's the day you're going to do your partial fast. What do you do on that day? How do you get to those 600 to 800 calories? There's a variety of ways you can do it. Our favorite approach in our practice is a mix of vegetables and nuts. And to give you a sense, you can eat it depends on the type of vegetable, but on an average, as a general rule, you can eat close to 12 cups of vegetables. That's a lot of vegetables, 12 cups of vegetables. And nuts, that's going to be a third of a cup or so. So a third of a cup of nuts, 12 cups of vegetables, and you're going to be right at that 800 calories. So that's one way of doing a partial fast day is what we call fasting mimicking, or a lifestyle medical fast. This is so Dr. Longo has actually gotten into commercially promoting something called Prolong. So he sells 800 calorie a day foods in this packaging called Prolong. But he gets to that 600 or 800 calories, and he does it primarily by the vegetable nut route, although the things that he does are a little more processed. Things that we do in our practice are definitely unprocessed. You can also do a potato fast. That becomes a nice fast to do. You could do fruits only, about eight fruits, apples, oranges, peaches, whatever, per day. It's about 800 calories per day. So again, this is
A fruit.
Pardon?
Can I ask you about doing a fruit cleanse, it's often called? I just know that many people who are working with disease, with cancer especially, they often put the patients on a fruit-free diet, sugar-free diet, even fruit, because of the sugar in the fruit. What do you think about that?
So it's a very good question, and there is a lot of debate about it. I don't have data on fruit and cancer. What I do have is data on fruit and diabetes, and I'm confident that a diabetic can eat fruit almost with impunity, almost as much as they want. It's not 100% true, but almost as much as they want. And their hemoglobin A1C or other diabetic data tends to not worsen. In fact, if anything, maybe improves. But let me just tell you what's underneath that. So if you're eating whole fruit, and the key thing is here, whole fruit. So that's the whole apple, it's the whole peach, it's the whole strawberry. You have to have the whole fruit. And one of the main reasons for that is the fiber. So fruit has a lot of sugar in it, but most fruit tends to have a lot of fiber in it as well. And if you get the fiber, then it doesn't drive your blood sugar up. The main reason it's prescribed in a cancer setting is because of driving your blood sugar up. So I think a whole fruit is generally okay. Now, a couple of caveats on that. One is there are some fruits where we tend to not eat the skin. And the biggest example of that is the melon category. So watermelon and cantaloupe and some of these other fruits, we tend to not eat the skin. And so those tend to have a higher glycemic index. And if you have a patient who's a diabetic or something like that, they need to be more cautious around those fruits where you don't eat the skin. Other fruits where you don't eat the skin include a lot of tropical fruits like mangoes or pineapples or bananas. And those are probably slightly better than melons because you do get a fair bit of fiber in them, at least compared to melons. But you probably still also have to be a little careful about those tropical fruits. The other fruit category where we tend to not eat the skin is citrus fruits, things like oranges and grapefruit. And kiwi sort of is, kiwi's not citrus, but it's close to citrus. And those seem to be okay, actually, because there tends to be more of the pulp and other things that's bringing high fiber into those fruits. So you have to be a little careful with fruit. But if it's the whole fruit, whole berries, whole apples, whole pears, those are very high fiber foods. Your stone fruits, your peaches and your plums and your cherries, those are not quite as free as the berries and the apples and pears. But so there's sort of a range, but as a general rule, I think that fruit is fine with those caveats that I gave you. And again, the data, I have good data that I could show you in a different slide set around fruit and diabetes. I don't around cancer so much, but I think it's sort of the same concept. Any other questions right now? Okay, I know I'm going long. Is that okay? We're actually getting closer to the end. So we're now still in this third category where we're talking about this idea of partial fast days. So this is just an example of the Prolong, which is this commercial product that Dr. Longo sells. But what we do in our practice is we do this 800 calories, and it's sort of in this, I said 12 cups of vegetables earlier, 10 cups, it depends on the carrots and the beets, those are higher caloric density, or dark green leafies, those tend to be very low caloric density. And then we do a third to a half a cup of nuts or avocado to get the fats. And then I mentioned the potato fat. That was sort of brought into the commercial space by this gentleman. His name is Andrew Taylor. This is his story. He was overweight and he wanted to lose weight, and he recognized that he had a bit of a food addiction. And so he said, well, what if I just choose one food and only eat one food? And he did some research, came across a Dr. McDougall. Dr. McDougall said, the perfect food to only eat is potatoes. So Andrew started eating potatoes only. And his commitment was to do it for 30 days. 30 days, I'm going to only eat potatoes. He got a doctor that was going to support him with. He's Australian, so he's from Australia. He got an Australian doctor that was supporting him in doing this. But he got to the end of the 30 days and he was doing so well, he said, well, I think I'm going to keep going. So he kept going. He ended up going a whole year where he only ate potatoes. And you can see the before and after pictures. He lost a lot of weight. He felt better. And what he ended up doing was actually someone had found out about him, and he got in the media there in Australia. And actually, I think it went worldwide. This crazy guy who's only eating potatoes. So anyways, we've brought in potato fasting into our clinic. So it is something that I try myself periodically, and that I give to my patients periodically. There's certain guidelines here. Obviously, it's a plain potato, but you can prepare it a variety of different ways. You can have any different type of potato, so it can be even sweet potatoes or yams, and you don't put any oil or anything. You can flavor it up with certain spices, but otherwise it's a potato diet. So just another way to go about your periodic fasting. So what I'm going to really focus on here is one of the other recommendations of Dr. Longo is that everybody should do a 5-day fast twice a year. So he says everybody should take 5 days in which you're fasting, and you should do that at least twice a year. And again, he's a longevity researcher. He does this because he feels like the science shows that if everyone did this, they would live longer. So there's a variety of ways you can do a 5-day fast. You can obviously do a water-only fast for 5 days. That's doable. I've done it before. We've done it in our practice before. That's hard, though. What we my favorite approach to fasting is what we show on the bottom. where you start off with an 800 calorie fast for day one, and then you do a water only fast for 3 middle days, and then you do 800 calories of fruit sort of as a coming off the fast as your final day. That's my favorite approach, but there's a variety of different ways you can do it. What Dr. Longo does is he gives people 800 calories for 5 days in a row. So he does this prolone basically for 5 days in a row. Our most common fast in our practice is this option 2, 800 calories for 5 days in a row. So not only can you do that 1 day a week, you can also do it for 5 days in a row as your periodic prolonged fasting. So that's the most common thing we do because it's very safe and no matter what problem you have. And it's also not that hard. It's hard. It's still hard to do 800 calories for 5 days in a row. People will get hungry. But we do as a group in our practice. So we usually have 20 or 30 people. We do it 3 times a year in our practice. And it works well for people.
Wayne, I just wanted to give a little comment. Yes, in my practice, I actually put people, but only those healthy young people without medication, but that with health conditions like allergies on a water fast, and it worked miracles really. And people didn't want to stop. So after 1 week, they didn't want to stop. They felt just wonderful. So allergies I had very good experience with treating allergies like the pollen outside in the air. And also I had a wonderful experience with one lady where she got plant-based, so leaving all the dairy and the meat, and but still her myoma did not disappear. So I just put her on a water fast, and then it disappeared within 1 month.
Myoma disappeared. Yeah.
Also amazing, yes.
So thanks for those stories. So I have a patient who was diabetic, was on insulin, and had been diabetic for 20 years or so, 15 or 20 years, and was a fairly healthy eater. So I thought he had type 1.5 diabetes, but he went on a 30-day water fast and his diabetes went away. He quit having to use insulin. So there are stories, and just to talk about safety with fasting, a water only fast, I think you're better off doing that with medical supervision. So obviously Maniela's a physician, I'm a physician. So, but you don't have to be a physician to be able to medically supervise a water only fast. But you need to know what you're doing if you do a water only fast, especially if you go past 5 days, but very specifically if you go past 10 days. So in our practice, I will supervise someone doing up to 10 days of a water fast. If they want to go more than 10 days, I won't supervise them anymore. I feel like they need to be in a residential program if they want to do a longer water fast. But even with a shorter water fast, even with a 5-day water fast, I prefer to be able to track people's blood sugars and their weights and their blood pressures and other things, just to make sure that we don't get in trouble. But it's actually safer than most people realize. And you know, as Manuela was saying, if you're doing shorter fasts in younger, healthier people, you basically don't have to worry about much of anything. There's a lot of guidance. I shouldn't be too cavalier about it, but
just a question about the fast here. I've heard someone talk about that after 36 hours, or within those first 36 hours, I didn't quite understand the explanation, but it was something with the physiology that there's a protein needed, an amino acid, something about a metabolite for the body to continue its detox. Have you ever heard anything about this? That protein is needed, and therefore this program that they have there, they do juicing, and then they have an additional protein on the within the 36 hours.
Yeah. So I don't know exactly what what that would be referencing. As I understand the physiology, I don't think there's a protein requirement, a separate protein requirement. But just to review the physiology, and I want to talk about about that question a little bit more. But just to review the physiology here on this slide, you know, a large amount of what our body obviously needs glucose as part of the core Krebs cycle and the cellular activity that happens in our body on an ongoing basis. We need that glucose, and as a general rule, a high percentage of the glucose that's in our system comes from just the exogenous glucose, which is the glucose that comes from the food that we just ate, which is why having some carbs is actually good, because carbs are easily broken down into glucose. But that obviously will wear out after 4 to 6 hours. And what our body does then is it starts going into the glycogen. And glycogen is primarily stored in the liver. It's where glucose sort of gets stored. So it's very easily available to our body. So even on a daily basis, our body's always tapping into that glycogen a bit. But that goes even our body taps into it even more aggressively if we do, you know, even a 12-hour fast, but more so if you're doing obviously a several-day fast. But that glycogen store, it's primarily in the liver. Some of it's in the muscle as well. That glycogen store runs out. And when you talked about the 36 hours, that's around the time the glycogen store is running out. So I'm guessing this protein theory has something to do with trying to help the body through going from the glycogen stores to this thing called gluconeogenesis. And gluconeogenesis is where your body is converting fat and protein into glucose, because your body needs the glucose. So then it's getting the glucose from these other stores in your body. So you know, as a general rule, it goes towards fat first. And when you're doing a longer water fast, you go into ketosis. So when people talk about the ketogenic diet, they're trying to create ketosis by putting a lot of fat in. But the better way to get to ketosis is to just not eat at all, and then you get ketosis naturally when you go into gluconeogenesis, and your body's converting the fat in your body into glucose to help you survive. It takes a long time before your body starts converting protein into glucose. So eventually, your body will start converting muscle mass into glucose as well. But that's usually, you know, you have to go on certainly longer than 10 days before that happens. You're generally going more towards 3 or 4 weeks before you're converting muscle into glucose. Depends on how much fat store you have in your body. Obviously, if you have a lot of fat store in your body, you can go much longer than that. Your body will just be converting the fat into glucose. But if you start off a fast and do a long fast without a lot of extra fat, then you'll convert muscle into glucose quicker. So bottom line, back to that question, I'm not aware of there being a missing protein that needs to be there in a fast. I'm pretty confident that it's not a consistent need. There may be a certain particular value based on a certain set of physiologic reactions. But I know, so to go to my
And what do you actually usually say about protein and carbohydrates? Because there's so much talk about that we need more protein versus that we know we need more carbohydrates.
Yeah, so I just wanted to show this slide. This is something called True North. It's in Northern California here in the US. They specialize in fasting. So they'll be, this is where my patient went on a 30-day fast. And when I started learning about fasting, because I'd never been trained in it in medical school or residency, I went here to learn about it. And I specifically went to this gentleman, Dr. Michael Clapper. So he was my mentor who taught me about how to help a patient through a fast and do it safely. So I can tell you, these people don't worry about protein and they don't worry about fat. Back to that general question about fat and protein, there's a lot of theories around it, but my personal theory is that you should have about 70% of your calories be carbohydrate, about 15% be fat, and about 15% be protein. And again, you can debate that from all different levels, but I think that's where the science takes us. And again, if you go to indigenous tribes, or if you go to historical diets, from 100 years ago, before there was all this processed food around, that tends to be about the place where people are. It's about a 70, 15, 15. One thing that's very clear, and again, in the discussion around protein and people eating all these protein shakes and all these kinds of things, it's very clear, though, if you look at the longevity research, that a high protein diet shortens your life. That data is not really, anybody who really knows longevity data will know that a high protein diet shortens your life. So, you can argue for protein because of muscle mass, and there's a variety of things you can argue, but I think as a general rule, most people eat too much protein. So if you have to work on protein with someone, it's generally trying to decrease protein, not increase protein.
And would you say that data includes plant-based protein? I mean, of longevity, shortening your life?
Yes. So it's hard to. So you're high. So obviously, at least in the U.S., I don't know what it's like in Germany, but at least in the U.S., when people think protein, they think meat. So they put the two together, protein and meat. And obviously that's a total false assumption. There's a lot of protein in all kinds of plants. There's a lot of protein in vegetables, especially beans. Those are the highest protein foods or plant-based foods. But yes, you can, the data around protein and longevity includes animal and plant-based proteins. But it's hard to get much more than 15% protein if you're on a plant-based diet. You'd have to eat only beans and nuts, I think, if you were gonna go much above 50%. So plant-based sort of naturally takes you to a 15% protein diet in my books.
Okay, sorry, did I get you right that the 50%, that was like a limit for this longevity analysis, that if it's over 50% in any case, that's gonna
over 15, 15,
okay.
Over 15%.
And that's with longevity over 15%.
Correct. So if you have more than 15% of your calories, 15% of your calories, you have more than that in protein, then your chance of having a long life starts going down. So I think that's a piece of data. Again, anybody in the longevity world knows that, but the average public doesn't know that. And it's a piece of data, I think, that should be talked about more. Okay, I know I'm way over time now, which I apologize, but so I'll just finish up these last few slides quickly. So this is just showing that doing this 5-day fast twice a year actually makes a difference physiologically. So these are obvious things like weight and BMI and body fat. A little less obvious things, but still it helps with blood sugar control. It helps with blood pressure. IGF-1, that's insulin growth factor 1. And what we know is if people have a lower insulin growth factor, they tend to live longer. So it's a marker that's again used by longevity researchers to try to guess how long someone's going to live. And so you're looking for a lower insulin growth factor. And if you do this fasting mimicking diet on a regular basis, it lowers your insulin growth factor. And then this is sort of segmenting it out more. So if you start off with a low insulin growth factor, then it doesn't make as much difference. But if you start off with a high insulin growth factor, it makes a big difference. Same with blood sugar, same with CRP, an inflammatory marker. So this makes a difference. And just to be clear, what this study specifically did is it did a 5-day, 800-calorie fast for you can see down here 3 cycles. So every month. So it did every month. So March 1, 2, 4, 5, April 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, May 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You went on an 800-calorie diet for 5 days for 3 months in a row. And that's where they got this physiologic data. So back to what Manuela was saying about allergies. I do this for people with rheumatoid arthritis. I do them 5 days, every month. I do it for a lot of autoimmune kinds of things, as well as for your metabolic diseases. It's actually also good in cancer treatment. Wouldn't guess that, but it's good in cancer treatment as well. But I think it's good for a lot of skin conditions. It's a valuable thing to do. So I'm going to just skip these slides. Again, this is just promoting the concept of fasting. And this is looking at it from sort of a spiritual perspective. If any of you have read Richard Foster, his book, The Celebration of Discipline, that's a classic spiritual growth book. And it says fasting is one of the core spiritual disciplines. And obviously, historically, biblically, fasting was very common. You think of fasting as keeping you out of balance, but our culture takes us the wrong way from a fast. And our fasting sort of brings us back into center, I think, if we fast. The final guideline that we talked about is mindful eating. Mindful eating is basically not multitasking while you're eating. It's just doing one thing while you eat. Again, there's a variety of physiologic benefits to that. So I don't have time to really go over this story, but just quickly, again, this is a real patient of mine. At one point, he was very overweight. He came to me when he'd already lost some of the weight. He had diabetes, he had a lot of arthritis, but his big concern was this rash. So he went on a whole food plant-based. He lost a lot more weight. His diabetes totally reversed. But the fascinating thing is how much his leg got better. And when he first came to me, he could barely walk. Now he's going out and playing Frisbee golf and doing amazing things. So just an example, and I'm sure all of you have your own stories of these things work not only for the diabetes and the weight loss and the things that we're familiar with, they work for other things too. They work for skin conditions and even for things like depression and as Manuela was talking about, allergies as well. So we're done. Sorry that I took so long. I'm happy to stay on for other questions, or we can wrap up. It's up to you all.
So are there more questions, comments, any thoughts for Wayne to ask? Because this is a chance.
Yeah, so somebody said, what is OR, O-R? And I think, I'm not quite sure what that's referring to, but I think when I used that in the slide set, it was literally the English word or, O-R. So it wasn't an abbreviation for anything. So you could do this or that.
But do you recommend 2 meals a day for children?
Do I recommend 2 meals a day for children? It's a great question. Well, so my practice doesn't include much in the way of children. So I have never had a parent ask me that question.
I do know someone who does that with their children, and they say that it's been good for them, but there's many people that say that that's not really so safe. But I don't know.
Right. So I'll just say this. Obviously, a newborn baby needs to eat more than twice a day, right? And, you know, at what point does it become safe, physiologically safe, for a child to eat twice a day? I don't know that. So anything I say is a guess, but I will make a guess that around 6 or 7 years of age, it would be safe. Before that, I would guess probably the 3 meals a day or something is better, but that's pretty much a guess. I don't really know that. I don't know if there's data around that. There may be data around that, but if there is, I'm not familiar with it. It's a good question, though. Anybody else know? Any data around that? Yeah.
Do you think it could be like, sometimes I reason maybe if they've eaten 2 decent meals, like an adult would eat 2 decent meals. I mean, many children are bad at eating at meals, but if they eat really 2 decent meals, then maybe they don't need the third then. But I don't know if it's scientifically good.
Yeah, so that's a good point. And what I've observed is that some people who eat 2 meals a day will eat very large meals. So they're trying to make up, which obviously counteracts the whole purpose of 2 meals a day. So yes, you know, could a kid sort of quotes make up for 3 meals and 2 meals? I do think they can, but you don't want to overeat on your 2 meals that you do eat as well, especially for adults, but even for kids, you have to think about that. Well, I appreciate your time. I'm sorry that I took too much time, but hopefully this was valuable to people. And I enjoy these kind of discussions, and I enjoy them because they're clinically practical too. They're things that we can do for ourselves as well as for our patients.